Welcome to today's gripping story, where ambition and deception collide in a dramatic tale of love, greed, and ultimate revenge. We begin with the seemingly perfect life of Nick and Jolie, a couple whose marriage appears to be a fairy tale. Jolie, the heiress to a massive fortune, marries Nick, a charming but deceitful man who sees an opportunity for personal gain. Their love story starts sweet and promising, but as we dig deeper, the cracks begin to show. From the joyous moments of their early marriage, we transition to the heart-wrenching reality of Jolie's struggle with a devastating illness. Despite Nick's feigned support, his true colors begin to emerge as Jolie's condition worsens. What follows is a whirlwind of betrayal, manipulation, and a shocking twist that reveals Jolie's true plans for her fortune. As we move from excitement to sorrow, the story culminates in a dramatic courtroom revelation that will leave you stunned. Watch as Nick's world comes crashing down, exposing the consequences of his greed and deception. The tale concludes with a poignant reminder of justice and the harsh realities of life's unexpected turns. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Nick and Jolie's marriage, a seemingly straightforward union 3 years ago, was shrouded in complexity and ulterior motives. To be honest, Nick's decision to marry Jolie was deeply intertwined with the unexpected twist of fate that thrust her into sole ownership of a lucrative business following her father's abrupt death. Her father, a robust and dynamic businessman, was taken from this world far too soon by a sudden stroke, leaving Jolie as his only heir and the rightful inheritor of his considerable wealth. For Nick, a strikingly handsome yet aimless man accustomed to living off the affluence of women, Jolie's inheritance was the glittering prize he had been waiting for. Initially, his interest in her was purely opportunistic, drawn by the allure of her newfound fortune rather than genuine affection. Jolie, still reeling from her father's loss and enveloped in profound grief, was enchanted by Nick's smooth promises and seemingly compassionate demeanor. Unbeknownst to her, Nick's intentions were far from sincere. He planned to remain by her side until a more advantageous opportunity presented itself. However, as time went on, Nick realized that Jolie herself was the jackpot he had been seeking. Her father's immense wealth was a treasure trove, and Nick, with his scheming mind, saw the chance to exploit her affections to secure his control over her inheritance. He calculated every move to ensure he could manipulate her deeper feelings for him, believing that he could leverage her vulnerability to gain complete control over her fortune. Everything appeared to be unfolding perfectly for Nick. Jolie, devastated by her father's passing the pillar of her life, and the person she cherished most, was easily drawn into his web of deceit. In her darkest hour, Nick showered her with seemingly genuine care and support, presenting himself as her rock during this time of profound sorrow. He skillfully maintained his facade of kindness and devotion, ensuring that Jolie had no reason to doubt his sincerity, especially after the funeral. Nick's expertise in deception, manipulation, and pretense allowed him to mold himself into whatever Jolie needed him to be. His usual practice with wealthy women had been to put forth minimal effort, confident that another affluent opportunity would come along. But with Jolie, the stakes were higher, and he was determined to make his efforts count. He understood the value of Jolie's name and the immense potential her inheritance offered. Yet, an unexpected challenge emerged from a source Nick had not anticipated. Jolie's father had a trusted confidant and key deputy in his company, Mr. Chinland, who was also her godfather. Mr. Chinland, astute and perceptive, immediately recognized Jolie's overwhelming grief and her desperate need for companionship. While he understood her emotional state, he also saw through Nick's scheming intentions. With sagacity and firm resolve, Mr. Chinland insisted on a prenuptial agreement, making it clear that he would not allow Jolie's wealth to be jeopardized by a manipulative charlatan. Through his wisdom and persistence, Mr. Chinlund manages to persuade Jolie to agree to the prenuptial terms, safeguarding her inheritance from Nick's grasp. "Nick, it's purely a formality for the sake of business. Is it that difficult to understand?" Jolie asked, repeating Mr. Chinlund's reasoning with a tone of frustrated resignation. "This is so demeaning. Do you believe I need your money?" Nick responded with indignation, his pride stung by the turn of events. "Darling, it's merely a precaution. We only need this in case of divorce. My godfather is adamant about it. He has always been like a second father to me," Jolie explained, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and resolve. While Jolie might have been inexperienced with financial intricacies, having never had to concern herself with money before, she was far from naive in other areas. When Jolie set her mind to something, she pursued it with unyielding determination. Backed into a corner, Nick had no choice but to concede to all of Mr. Chinlund's stipulations. The marriage contract, though standard in its formulation, was designed to severely restrict Nick's rights. It was crystal clear that Jolie's inherited business and other properties would remain entirely separate from their joint assets. Nick had anticipated gaining a share of the dividends and acquiring new property and assets, but the contract drafted by an exceptionally skilled lawyer ensured that he would be completely excluded from such benefits. Despite the restrictive terms, Nick remained optimistic. He saw the marriage as still advantageous, convinced that he could tap into Jolie's finances without direct oversight, allowing him to amass capital for the future. He planned to siphon funds from their joint budget into his name. However, Nick was mistaken in this regard as well. Mr. Chinlund, a man of unwavering integrity and diligence, meticulously monitored both Jolie's business finances and her accounts. Nick's access to personal funds was severely limited, yet he maintained a hopeful outlook, eager to see how things would unfold. Soon, Nick's patience began to bear fruit. Jolie, who had been fervently trying to conceive since their wedding, was experiencing an emotional roller coaster. Her yearning for motherhood was met with repeated cycles of bitterness and disappointment. Initially, she attributed her struggles to stress and the relentless demands of her new business responsibilities. She threw herself into her work, learning and adapting as she went, which took a toll on her well-being. After over a year of fruitless attempts, Jolie sought medical help. She underwent extensive examinations to uncover the cause of her fertility issues. What she had initially dismissed as stress-induced symptoms turned out to be serious health warnings. The diagnosis was devastating cancer. For nearly 2 years, Jolie endured grueling treatments and profound suffering, with little progress to show for it. Throughout this harrowing period, Nick's role as a husband was superficial at best, his emotional support as thin as his initial intentions. Nick's disdain for Jolie had become increasingly transparent, despite his attempts to shroud it in secrecy. His vested interest in her disappearance was glaringly evident, and his failure to mask his true feelings was becoming more apparent by the day. Although they never directly addressed it, Jolie was acutely aware of her husband's numerous extramarital affairs. Despite his belief in his skillful deception and manipulation, Nick's facade of a devoted husband to his terminally ill wife was unraveling. He deluded himself into thinking that he was playing the role of the caring spouse convincingly enough to avoid suspicion, convinced that he merely needed to endure a little longer to achieve his coveted outcome. Nick's egregious behavior did not go unnoticed by those around him. The staff at the hospitals where Jolie received treatment, including the nurses who witnessed his lack of genuine concern, discussed his actions in hushed tones. They saw through his charade, recognizing the stark contrast between his outward appearance of dedication and his actual indifference. This sentiment was shared by Mr. Chinlund, who was both infuriated and helpless in the face of Nick's machinations. Mr. Chinlund, who had always been like a second father to Jolie, was incensed by Nick's blatant disregard for his goddaughter's well-being. He struggled to comprehend why Jolie was clinging so desperately to her marriage, even as she faced the brink of death. The situation was further complicated by the troubling fact that Jolie had left no will. As a result, Nick would automatically inherit everything, including the fruits of Jolie's and her father's hard work, a prospect that filled Mr. Chinland with deep anxiety. Mr. Chinland feared that Nick, with his evident greed and lack of moral compass, would squander the substantial inheritance within a few short years. This concern was compounded by the realization that Jolie's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She had once radiated health and vitality, but now she was faced with the grim reality of impending death, with only weeks left to live. The stark contrast between her former self and her current state was a poignant reminder of how quickly life could change. As Jolie's condition worsened, Nick's anticipation grew. He was already mentally calculating the future, his eyes gleaming with a predatory gleam as he envisioned himself rid of his sick wife and in possession of a substantial fortune. He believed that the situation was practically settled, seeing the inheritance as a foregone conclusion. Nick's thoughts were consumed with the prospects of acquiring wealth and capital, seeing his wife's impending death as a mere stepping stone to his financial goals. Mr. Chinland, meanwhile, was grappling with the immense challenge of how to address this delicate and distressing situation. He was deeply concerned about how to protect Jolie's legacy and ensure that her inheritance did not fall into the hands of her unscrupulous husband. The task seemed nearly insurmountable as he struggled to navigate the complexities of Jolie's failing health, Nick's unscrupulous behavior, and the legal and emotional ramifications of the situation. The urgency of the matter was palpable, and Mr. Chinland was acutely aware that time was running out. He was determined to find a solution that would honor Jolie's legacy and prevent her hard-earned fortune from being squandered by someone who had shown no genuine regard for her well-being. Mr. Chinland fervently hoped that he would not have to broach the subject of the will himself, but fate had other plans. To his immense relief, Jolie took the initiative, sparking a conversation that left him utterly astonished. Her meticulous planning, executed with a cold precision and ruthlessness that surpassed his expectations, revealed a stunningly orchestrated act of revenge. It was as if she had perfected the art of delivering a bitter blow from beyond the grave, and her execution of this final scheme was nothing short of masterful. Jolie's preparation was swift and efficient, a testament to her determination to see her principal dreams fulfilled before leaving this world. Despite her valiant efforts, a miracle of recovery eluded her, and she passed away without witnessing her aspirations come to fruition. In her final days, she arranged every detail of her funeral with meticulous care, ensuring that her final wishes were communicated with serene clarity and unyielding resolve. The day following the farewell ceremony, the notary contacted those named in Jolie's will, summoning them for its formal reading. Nick's shock was palpable when he received the news. He had been certain that Jolie had not prepared any official legal document regarding her estate and had naively assumed he would automatically be her sole heir, as is often the case under such circumstances. Holding on to a faint hope for a favorable outcome, he attended the meeting with his new mistress, Shirley, a striking beauty whose presence he believed might bolster his standing. As Nick entered the notary's office, he immediately noticed Mr. Chinland and Jolie's friend Kurt Turgon. But what truly disconcerted him was Kurt's unexpected companion, a stroller containing a baby boy. Nick was well aware of Kurt's marital status and the absence of any recent news regarding a child. Although Nick was hardly a connoisseur of legal or familial intricacies, he was perceptive enough to realize that something was amiss. It dawned on him that he had been outmaneuvered in a scheme that promised to unveil a most humiliating revelation. Despite his rising anxiety, Nick's curiosity proved overpowering. He was eager to uncover the details of Jolie's final machinations, even as he braced himself for the inevitable disgrace that awaited him. For what seemed like an eternity, Approximately 15 minutes. Everyone remained in contemplative silence, each occupying their corner of the room. The anticipation was palpable, and as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that no additional attendees would arrive. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Nick and the others awaited the notary's announcement, the weight of Jolie's final decisions hanging heavily in the air. The notary, with an air of deliberate solemnity, seemed to stretch the introductory portion of the proceedings to its maximum length. He spoke with measured gravity about the honor of being entrusted with the task of reading the deceased's last will. Nick, however, was acutely aware of the wicked grin that played across Mr. Chinland's face, a grin that hinted at the delicious secret the will contained, one that seemed to be reserved solely for Nick's dismay. As the notary finally began to read aloud, the words were sharp and unrelenting. "To my lawful husband, Nick, I deny the inheritance." The simplicity and finality of the statement were almost cruel in their clarity. Nick's heart sank as the notary's gaze locked onto him, a silent challenge to acknowledge the reality of what had just been declared. With a face flushed with embarrassment and shock, Nick had no choice but to nod in acknowledgement, his pride shattered. Beside him, Shirley, his new mistress, reached for his hand and attempted to rise from her seat, her movements filled with a mix of defiance and curiosity. Her questioning look met with Nick's stony silence. He wanted nothing more than to escape the scene of his public humiliation, to retreat from the cruel twist of fate that had befallen him. Yet, he knew he had to endure the remainder of the proceedings. The audience, including Mr. Chinland and Kurt Turgon, needed to witness the full extent of Jolie's final act. The notary paused briefly, savoring the moment of tension that hung in the air before continuing with the reading. The next revelation was even more astonishing. "I bequeath all my personal property to my only son, Robert Turgon. Until he reaches adulthood, I appoint his father, Kurt Turgon, and Mr. Chinland as guardians and administrators of his estate." The gravity of the bequest was unmistakable. Jolie had not only ensured that Nick would receive nothing, but had also carefully designated the future of her estate. Her son, Robert Turgon, was to inherit everything, with Kurt Turgon and Mr. Chinland appointed to oversee and protect the estate until the child came of age. This strategic move not only excluded Nick from any financial benefit, but also ensured that the assets accumulated through Jolie's and her father's hard work would be safeguarded and managed by those she trusted most. As the notary's words sank in, the atmosphere in the room was charged with an almost palpable sense of triumph and vindication, especially from Mr. Chinland's side. Nick's earlier sense of entitlement and expectation lay in ruins, replaced by the crushing realization of his utter exclusion from Jolie's legacy. The finality of the will was a testament to Jolie's calculated resolve, and the implications of her decisions would undoubtedly ripple through the lives of those present, leaving an indelible mark on their futures. The revelation struck Nick with the force of a sledgehammer, leaving him breathless and reeling. The shock of discovering that Kurt was the father of Jolie's child hit him like a gut punch. The room seemed to close in around him as he struggled to process the staggering truth. Unable to contain his disbelief, he burst out with a horrified scream, his patience frayed beyond repair. The atmosphere in the room was electric with tension, but Nick and Shirley were the only ones caught off guard. The others were visibly unruffled. "Is the boy Jolie's biological child?" Nick's voice cracked with desperation and disbelief, his eyes wide with incredulity. His breath came in ragged gasps as he awaited the answer that he already feared would crush him further. "Yes, Robert is the biological son of Jolie and Kurt, Mr. Chinland clarified with grim satisfaction. "She hasn't been pregnant in the past 2 years. The child was conceived through artificial insemination before Nick and Jolie got married." The revelation hit Nick like a cold wave of realization. His mind spun as he tried to reconcile this new information with the reality he had known. Kurt's face, in stark contrast, beamed with quiet satisfaction, reflecting the victory of a well-executed plan. Nick's entire world seemed to tilt as he absorbed the magnitude of Jolie's deception. Jolie kept the boy a secret from everyone, even me, until after his birth, Mr. Chinland continued, his expression unwavering. She did this to shield him from any potential threats and to ensure that her inheritance would be untouched by outside interference. Her intention was clear. She wanted to secure her son's future without letting Nick have any claim to it. Jolie's resolve was steadfast. She wanted to make certain that her inheritance would be preserved for Robert alone, free from Nick's grasp. Mr. Chinland's words were delivered with a cold detachment, underscoring the meticulous care Jolie had taken to safeguard her son's future. All assets are to be held in trust for Robert until he reaches adulthood. Should he wish to distribute or utilize any of the assets before then, it will require the written consent of both Kurt Turgon and myself. I trust that you understand the gravity of this arrangement. With that, the notary concluded the reading of the will, his tone implying that the matter was now settled. He glanced around the room, inquiring if there were any questions, but Nick was far from ready for any further pleasantries. His gaze turned sharply towards Shirley, who was now wearing a scowl, her earlier composure visibly faltering. The weight of the situation pressed heavily upon Nick, leaving him grappling with the realization that Jolie had orchestrated a legacy that would forever exclude him, cementing his failure and humiliation in the most profound way possible. Nick's mind raced with images of Shirley, his mistress, likely brooding over the financial windfall she now stood to lose. Her disdain for him was palpable as she surveyed the scene with a smirk, knowing that their previously cushioned lifestyle had come crashing down around them. Nick's gaze swept across the room, noting how everyone else seemed buoyed by a sense of victory and satisfaction. For him, this was not just a personal defeat, but a public scandal of the highest order. The room, once a place of hopeful anticipation, now felt like a courtroom where he stood condemned. The weight of his failure was crushing, and he felt utterly exposed, unable even to contemplate asking Mr. Chinland how he had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. The realization of his misjudgment and folly was like a leaden weight, dragging him down into an abyss of humiliation and regret. As the notary and the others departed, leaving the office in a silence that seemed to mock him, Nick was left alone with Shirley. The shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. Where she had once shared in his ill-conceived ambitions, she now exuded a sense of triumph over his downfall. Her satisfaction was thinly veiled by a disdainful look as she made her exit, leaving Nick to confront his shattered dreams and the stark reality of his situation. Now, Nick stood at a crossroads with nothing but his self-pity for company. The easy life he had envisioned was gone, replaced by the harsh truth of his failures. He faced a stark choice: either he would need to find new sources of income through other means or make a concerted effort to earn money on his own. The delusion of a life built on others' wealth and his deceit had disintegrated, and he was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. The end of this chapter marked not just a personal defeat, but a profound reckoning with the reality he had so skillfully tried to avoid. Nick's future, once so promisingly gilded, now lay in tatters, demanding a reckoning with the choices he had made and the harsh truth of his responsibility. Nick, overwhelmed by the seismic shock of the revelation, found himself spiraling into a state of frantic disbelief. His emotions erupted uncontrollably, leading him to spew a torrent of incoherent accusations and enraged outbursts. He was a man possessed, driven by a fury that clouded his judgment and made him lash out without regard for the consequences. Kurt, the embodiment of restraint and stoicism, struggled to contain his rising temper, his fists clenching as he fought the urge to physically confront the insufferably arrogant man. Even Mr. Chinland, usually the epitome of calm and composure, was visibly flushed with indignation, his usual demeanor disrupted by the gravity of the situation. The notary, however, remained an island of serene detachment amidst the storm. For him, this was just another day at the office, and the drama unfolding was merely part of the routine. With the practiced calm of a seasoned professional, he addressed Nick's frantic demands. Included with the will are the child's birth certificate and the relevant medical documents. Additionally, as per the deceased's explicit instructions, we have a DNA test confirming that Robert Turgon is indeed the biological child of your late wife. Rest assured, all the necessary documents have been compiled meticulously. Desperate to grasp any shred of hope, Nick's eyes narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and determination. "May I see the documents?" he demanded, his voice laced with both frustration and desperation. "No," the notary replied coolly. "You are entitled only to review the documents about your interests. All information regarding the child is confidential and can only be disclosed with the consent of the child's guardians." Kurt, quick to assert his position, interjected firmly, "I do not grant permission for the disclosure of those documents." His voice held the weight of authority and resolve. Any request for such documents would have to be pursued through court proceedings if deemed necessary. This was the final blow for Nick. He stormed out of the office, his anger manifesting in a violent slam of the door behind him. He stormed off with an indignant vow to contest the entire matter, his mind racing with plans for retribution. Shirley, on the other hand, displayed a more composed demeanor. With a polite nod, she bade farewell and exited quietly, closing the door with a controlled yet finality that underscored the end of their shared ambitions. "Is it of any concern that he did not sign the acknowledgement of the will's reading, Mr. Chinland?" inquired of the notary, his tone reflecting a mix of curiosity and irritation. "Not at all," the notary reassured him with the practiced indifference of someone accustomed to such scenarios. "It's a mere formality. There are many like him. His refusal to acknowledge the reading is inconsequential in the grand scheme." Mr. Chinland, reflecting on the absurdity of the situation, muttered to himself, "It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. I still cannot fathom how Jolie ever became entangled with someone like him." His rhetorical question lingered in the air, unanswered and reflective of the bizarre nature of their predicament. The men quickly concluded their business, signing the requisite documents and exchanging firm handshakes. Mr. Chinland then assisted Kurt in settling little Robert into the stroller with a gentle touch. "Would you care to join us?" Kurt extended the invitation, his voice warm and inviting. "A walk in the fresh air would do us all good, and it's beneficial for the baby." The offer was met with a nod of agreement, and as they prepared to leave the office, the atmosphere shifted from one of confrontation to a more tranquil setting, leaving behind the echoes of Nick's explosive outburst and moving forward into a more hopeful future. "Certainly I'll join for a while, Mr. Chinland replied, his voice steady but laced with a hint of reflection. They began their walk in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the stroller wheels against the pavement. The serene atmosphere offered a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions that had just unfolded. As they moved, Kurt broke the silence, his voice tinged with both regret and contemplation. "Do you think Jolie would be satisfied with how I'm coping?" He looked to Mr. Chinland, his eyes searching for reassurance. "I'm confident she would be, Mr. Chinland responded earnestly. "You've shown yourself to be a wonderful father. It's clear how much you both mean to each other and how deeply you care for Robert." Kurt's brow furrowed as he continued. "To be honest, there's one thing I can't shake from my mind. I think Jolie mentioned that I was against what happened today at the notary." Mr. Chinland's expression grew thoughtful. "Are you referring to the dramatic revelation of the will and Nick's reaction?" "Exactly," Kurt said, his voice heavy with regret. "I was always uncomfortable with the way things unfolded. I felt that provoking Nick was dangerous. He's a vile character, angry, petty, and driven by greed. I even considered revealing Robert's existence only after he was born, thinking it would be better to keep the matter secret. I believe Jolie had her reasons and wanted to shield Robert from unnecessary conflict. Mr. Chinlin nodded, understanding the gravity of Kurt's concerns. And now, after seeing Nick's reaction and the disgraceful way he carried himself with that woman, you question if you made the right choice. Yes, Kurt admitted, his voice breaking. His reaction was horrifying. It makes me wonder if we should have dealt with him sooner. Jolie's desire for revenge seemed to be fueled by her love for Robert, her way of protecting him. I realize now that her love, intense and corrupted by the circumstances, may have played a role in her decision. She wanted to ensure Nick had no claim to her legacy, even if it meant manipulating the situation. Mr. Chinlin's eyes softened as he listened to Kurt's lament. It's clear that Jolie was deeply conflicted. Her actions were a manifestation of her love and her desire to safeguard Robert from harm. It's a tragic irony that her protective instincts, while noble, resulted in such a painful and public confrontation. Kurt's shoulders slumped as he reflected on Mr. Chinlin's words. "My poor girl," he said, wiping a tear from his cheek. She was caught in a struggle between love and vengeance, and it seems her final act was one of both protection and defiance. I wish things could have been different, that we could have spared her from this bitter end. The two men continued their walk in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging heavily in the air. The stroller wheels whispered against the ground, a gentle reminder of the new life they were committed to nurturing. As they moved forward, the path ahead seemed both uncertain and filled with the promise of healing, marking a new chapter for Robert and a chance to honor Jolie's memory in a way that would make her proud. Don't grieve for her. She asked us not to. She asked us to direct all our love, which was for her, to Robbie, Kurt said, offering comfort to Mr. Chinlin. Mr. Chinlin nodded, grateful for Kurt's words. You're right. Jolie wanted us to focus on caring for Robert, not dwelling on her departure. We owe it to her to honor her final wishes. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to the poignant scene at Jolie's house, Nick and Shirley sat in the dim interior of Nick's small apartment, discussing their newfound predicament. "So you won't get anything at all, right?" Shirley asked, her voice filled with disbelief as she blinked rapidly. "Of course not," Nick replied bitterly. "That foundling has ruined everything. But you know what? Let's not dwell on that. We need to salvage something valuable and move it to my place. It's the least we can do." 3 days later, Kurt gathered the courage to visit Jolie's house, only to find it eerily empty. He had prepared himself for a confrontation, even hiring 2 security guards for protection, but Nick had anticipated this and left before Kurt's arrival, taking with him a substantial amount of valuables. Now, Nick sat alone in the cramped kitchen of his modest apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey. Shirley had left him, as he had expected. Why would she stay with a beggar like me? Nick mused aloud, feeling a deep sense of abandonment. He couldn't help but reflect on his current dire situation. Once, women had paid him to be in their company, but now he was forced to pay a young, beautiful girl just to keep her around. The irony was not lost on him. Nick, once a gigolo in his prime, had deteriorated due to his vices and poor choices. He had foolishly expected that his wife's inheritance would provide him with a new lease on life, but instead, he found himself empty-handed. In his self-pity, he blamed his deceased wife for draining his vitality and shattering his hopes. He had eagerly anticipated the inheritance, dreaming of a future filled with wealth and success. Instead, he was left to grapple with the harsh reality of his situation. Shirley's departure had struck a blow to his fragile ego. Her final words, harsh as they were, rang true. No one needed him now. He was nothing more than a poor drunkard living in delusions of grandeur. His dreams of becoming a successful businessman and living a life of luxury had crumbled like a house of cards. Yet, in his blinded arrogance, he failed to see his role in his downfall. Instead, he clung to the belief that his deceased wife was the sole cause of his troubles, unable to confront his shortcomings and poor decisions. As he stared at the empty walls of his tiny apartment, the once bright and hopeful visions of his future seemed like a cruel joke. The whiskey did little to numb the sting of reality, and he was left to wrestle with the bitter truth his aspirations and delusions had led him to a life far removed from the one he had once envisioned. Nick spent nearly 2 weeks lost in a drunken haze, using alcohol as a refuge from the harsh reality that had befallen him. His sense of resentment and humiliation festered with each passing day. The sting of defeat was exacerbated by a recent encounter with Mr. Chinlin's men, who had come to reclaim the car keys and tear up the power of attorney that Jolie had granted him. Their condescending attitude only deepened Nick's frustration. "Didn't you know the power of attorney loses its legal force after the death of the person who issued it?" one of the men had sneered, further humiliating him. Nick, who had previously seen himself as a self-sacrificing husband, chose to ignore the reality of his actions as gambling, alcohol abuse, and general neglect of Jolie. In his drunken reverie, he often fantasized about hitting her in his anger, a testament to the deep-seated resentment he had harbored all along. "What a pity that she's dead and I can't hit her," he mused bitterly, reflecting on how he had restrained himself from acting out on his worst impulses, believing that his patience would eventually be rewarded. But as the days of inebriation dragged on, a sudden clarity pierced through his haze. He realized that wallowing in his misery would get him nowhere. If he wanted revenge, he needed to take decisive action. The thought of desecrating Jolie's grave crossed his mind, but a more sinister idea soon took its place. He considered what would truly cause Jolie the most suffering. His focus shifted to Robert, the child Jolie had so carefully protected. The idea hit Nick with the force of a jolt of electricity. A twisted smile spread across his face as he formulated his plan. His vengeance would not be aimed at the grave of Jolie, but rather at her son, Robert. The thought of striking at the very thing Jolie had cherished most filled him with cruel satisfaction. He knew this plan would require careful planning and execution, but he was undeterred. The primary goal of his scheme was to torment Jolie through her son, to make her suffer even in death. Nick envisioned that the ultimate nightmare for any mother would be the helplessness of not being able to protect her child from harm, and that was exactly the kind of suffering he intended to inflict. With renewed determination, Nick set about devising his revenge. He knew he had to be meticulous and shrewd, but he also understood that his actions would be driven by deep-seated anger and a desire to make Jolie pay for the perceived injustices he felt he had endured. His plans were steeped in malice, and he was prepared to go to great lengths to execute them. Nick's plan was cold and calculated, driven by a simmering hatred and a twisted sense of justice. The idea of kidnapping the baby and leaving him at an orphanage, far from the life he was meant to have, gave Nick a perverse sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a while, he felt a grim sense of purpose. As he reveled in his dark fantasies, a cruel smile, more resembling a snarl, formed on his face. The thought of Jolie's suffering from beyond the grave brought him a fleeting sense of euphoria. Determined to make his plan a reality, Nick began to focus on the practical details. He needed to gather information on Robert's daily routine, who took care of him, and the security measures in place around Kurt's home. His familiarity with Kurt and his family was an advantage. He had visited their upscale suburban home in the past and knew about the elite community's heightened security. The task ahead was daunting. Nick envisioned himself spending countless hours hiding in the woods, peering through binoculars, and meticulously documenting the child's movements. The process would be slow and tedious, but Nick was willing to endure it. His obsession with revenge consumed him, overshadowing any doubts about the feasibility of his plan. He reasoned that the anguish he intended to cause Jolie's child was worth the effort. To him, this was not merely a form of retribution, but a way to balance the scales of his perceived injustice. The thought of the wealthy heir being reduced to a state of dependency on the government, while Jolie watched from the afterlife, fueled his determination. Nick's mind became fixated on the idea, pushing aside any remnants of moral restraint. He was prepared to go to great lengths to execute his plan, driven by the belief that he was delivering a measure of justice for himself. His mental state, already unstable from the fallout of the will and his current situation, further deteriorated as he obsessively honed his strategy. Nick's descent into madness was now complete, his thoughts dominated by a vengeful obsession. His once familiar surroundings seemed foreign to him, twisted by his warped sense of justice. With a grim determination, he dedicated 2 full days to meticulous preparation. He was driven by a single, relentless purpose to execute his plan with precision. He spent these days surveying the area surrounding Kurt's upscale residence. The elite suburban settlement was a fortress, its security robust and its inhabitants vigilant. Nick's task was to find a vantage point that provided a clear view of the entire community. He explored the terrain, assessing potential locations where he could observe the comings and goings of Robert's nannies without arousing suspicion. The task was not without its challenges. The settlement's security measures were designed to deter intruders, and Nick had to be discreet. He took extensive notes on the patterns of movement within the community, identifying the times when Robert's caregivers arrived and departed. His planning was precise, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. In addition to scouting the area, Nick prepared a kit with all the tools necessary for his plan. He assembled masks and gloves to avoid leaving any trace of his presence. The kit also included items to assist in the abduction and to ensure that his identity remained hidden. Every item was carefully selected to minimize the risk of detection. As he worked, his mind was consumed by dark thoughts. The satisfaction he derived from planning his revenge was the only solace he found amidst the turmoil of his life. His obsession drove him to be thorough and relentless. There was no room for error. Every aspect of the plan had to be executed flawlessly. Nick's transformation was stark. Once a man seeking wealth and comfort, he had become a figure driven by a bitter desire for retribution. His moral compass had been replaced by a cold, calculating mindset. The prospect of success in his dark endeavor offered him a twisted sense of purpose, overshadowing any remnants of remorse or doubt. With everything in place, Nick felt a perverse sense of anticipation. He was ready to set his plan into motion, fully prepared to carry out his grim objective. The time for contemplation was over. The time for action had arrived. Nick's carefully laid plan had reached its climax, and he was set on executing it without a hitch. He had spent weeks meticulously studying Kurt's estate, learning the intricacies of the security system, and mapping out every detail of his approach. With his preparations complete, he knew the time had come to act. The baby's first birthday was an opportune moment, given the planned celebrations and distractions. On the eve of the planned abduction, Nick successfully infiltrated Kurt's estate. Using his acquired skills and knowledge, he managed to install a hidden camera that recorded Robert's daily movements. The following day, he observed the routine of Robert's nanny, noting her habits and schedules. Everything appeared predictable and under control. At the designated time, Nick put his plan into action. He swiftly seized Robert, moving with the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment for weeks. However, his confidence was shattered when Kurt unexpectedly appeared. The confrontation was brutal and disorienting. Kurt, driven by a protective instinct, fought fiercely to reclaim his son. Nick, caught off guard by Kurt's unexpected intervention and the ensuing chaos, found himself in a desperate struggle. In the heat of the moment, Nick's plan began to unravel. The struggle with Kurt left him breathless and disoriented. The noise and commotion attracted attention, and Nick realized that he was running out of time. His initial plan of a quiet, unnoticed escape was disintegrating before his eyes. Fearing that the situation was slipping from his grasp, he made a frantic decision to abandon Robert and flee. Nick's escape was thwarted by the neighborhood's vigilant security measures. The patrols and guards, already on high alert due to the birthday celebrations, quickly responded to the disturbance. Nick's frantic flight through the neighborhood was marked by increasing desperation. Despite his efforts to blend in and avoid detection, he was soon spotted and pursued by the authorities. In the end, Nick's elaborate scheme was undone by unforeseen complications and his miscalculations. The authorities apprehended him, and his plan lay in ruins. His attempt at revenge had backfired spectacularly, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his actions. Nick was left to confront the reality of his failure and the full weight of his decisions as he faced legal repercussions for his crime. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you found the information valuable and engaging. So far, we've covered a range of topics and insights that are designed to enrich your knowledge and skills. We'd love to hear from you. Please share one thing you've learned today and how you plan to apply it in your life. Leave your comment below this video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comments, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us bring you more great videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.